It's a pleasure to welcome you today to the MCA and to introduce the wonderful artist Jitish Kallat, whose work Covering Letter is an absolutely central linchpin of the exhibition Telling Tales in our Level 3 galleries. My name is Rachel Kent. I'm the Chief Curator here at the MCA. I'm the curator of the Telling Tales exhibition. But today we are here to hear from the wonderful Jitish himself. He's going to give us a fantastic overview and insight of his practice with some reference to the work on display, but we'll get a much bigger image of his practice, I think, over the next hour. In terms of the structure of events, Jitish will talk for 30-40 minutes. He has images to show you of his work. We'll then have a quick Q&A at the end of Jitish's talk, and we'll open up to questions from you. So if there is anything burning that you want to ask, hang on to it. Or you may get something as you watch the images that he shows you, but hang on to that because there is an opportunity to talk with Jitish at the end of the presentation. In short, Jitish is a leading Indian artist, born in 1974, lives and works in Mumbai. He's come to us especially from Mumbai. He's been here for about a week, and as I said, his work is really central to the exhibition Telling Tales, which is very much about narrative and the ways that artists approach storytelling, both conceptually but also materially. I'll hand over to Jitish now because we have limited time, but please join me in welcoming Jitish Kallat.
Thank you, Rachel. It's been a great pleasure, in a way, being in this extremely productive conversation, dialogue, collaboration with you over the last couple of years that finally takes form in the form of a contribution to the exhibition. I'm really thrilled to be part of this dialogue too. And to see so many friends in the room also tells me there have been enduring friendships over the last 2 decades here in Sydney, which is so nice. One of the really interesting things that really a thought about some of the conversations we've been having, both as artist colleagues from the exhibition in the room, some of us have shared panels in the last couple of days, and to really think of the notion of the narrative and the story as not just the story as an artifact that might emerge within books we might write or films we might make or pictures we might create, but stories as a kind of enduring aspect of our own cognition, as if stories are what we cognize the world with. We wake up to the day by kind of localizing ourselves in space and time with our own story of the day or the story of the day gone by, and we are continuously kind of hoisting stories or unhoisting them in some ways to kind of gain a glimpse of the infinite truth as we all seek our own way of understanding the world. And in our inability probably to grapple with this enormity of the truth of the world, we settle in some ways through understanding the relative. And in some ways the relative is really the space of the story, because the moment you have two things, you have scale, you have dimension, you have time, and you have units and periodicity that give you some kind of a definition to access reality for that moment until you can access yet another reality with another story. So it's been a really interesting week, really, to participate in dialogues, panels, conversations, and to reflect on one's own practice within this context. In the last few days, I've been trying to just put together some slides that would fit into about 40 minutes or so of a conversation and try to get a kind of quick glimpse of 20 years of work, which also when you do so, you realize that every time you put in or take out an image, you also create or uncreate a certain story. You're obviously, again, trying to get a version of your own work and trying to understand it through a certain process. So what I might have today is really not a chronological or comprehensive view of my work. I might also be going back and forth quite a lot between recent work and older work, and I hope that won't be too taxing. But this is intuitively how it came to me when I was kind of laying out images. And it kind of reflects what's on in my studio at this moment. I'm working on a sort of like a survey of 20 years of my work, which would become an exhibition in Jan 2017 with the curator Catherine David. And in some ways, this might project into what's also in terms of a retrospective view of one's own work in the studio. So this is a piece that I made in 2011, and it's a work called Epilogue. And Epilogue appears like a cascade of images laid one after the other. And it opens, it's a photo piece that kind of unfolds into a labyrinth. And it goes on. And it begins to appear like a self-similar recurrence of the same image that goes on and on and on. And it's only at some point when you kind of access it more closely that you realize that no two frames, each one that bears a lunar cycle, no two frames are essentially the same, as no two lunar cycles are the same. And yet these lunar cycles are formed by a progressively eaten bread. So in fact, every moon is in fact a roti. It's a progressively eaten bread that becomes a crescent moon, or an uneaten roti becomes a full moon. And it kind of goes on until a point where it comes to draws to a closure. And so when I exhibited for the first time, there wasn't any contextual text. And this is a work I kind of grappled with, even with the genesis of it, whether it would mean anything to anyone else at all. It's essentially every moon that my father saw from the day he was born on 2nd April 1936 until he passed away on 1st December 1998. And so it's every moon of his lifetime that kind of unfolds. And for my own experience, it's been exhibited a few times in different parts of the world. And each time I've noticed that people move closer to a particular frame and find a moon of their own birth. And then perhaps enter this broad expanse of images through the rotis. But it's also been interesting that this particular work that for me came out of really thinking of my father's life, thinking of ideas of time, of fullness and emptiness, abundance and dearth, and all these other themes that became part of his life, but anyone's life too, has been read in so many ways. I mean, I was in the studio once and this work was being packed and for some shipment, and a friend, Phil Tinari, who you may know from the Ulan Center, happened to be in the studio, and he just picked a frame randomly in the studio, and he said, "This is the day America attacked Iraq," and I thought he was joking, and he said, no, it was a new moon night, that they picked, and it was actually true. And to me, suddenly the entire work turned around, and there have been others who've looked at the midnight of Indian independence and sort of tried to find a moon, and perhaps and hence unfolds a completely unforeseen story out of what somebody else points to. But this was a piece I made roughly 10 years before I made Epilogue, and in fact it took the making of the photo piece Epilogue to kind of reflect back on a piece that came out of what would then, about 12 or 13 years ago, appear like images that have kind of entered the studio from a glimpse of a moment going by in a city, in a street, on a railway station, that would then become the central pivot for an act of painting. But it's really after Epilogue that I actually even began articulating the title, that the 22,000 sunsets was really the number of sunsets my father saw. And it took almost 10 years for the sunsets to become moonrises and become a completely different form, a completely different structure. But yet they're almost like the same work, sort of reincarnating 10 years apart. And that's possibly, as you may see in my work, there isn't a sort of mediumistic affinity between all the work I make, or linguistic or scale. I kind of go back and forth between forms, images, and yet they kind of reincarnate over long durations, 4 years, 3 years. And so something like 22,000 Sunsets, a decade later, became paintings like this. So this was a piece called Baggage Claim. And Baggage Claim was kind of large. It's about almost like this, bigger than the size of the screen, and like wall scaled. And in some of these paintings, what begins as a glimpse of a moment, often with a picture, then becomes in the process of painting yet another possibility to start rethinking the world. So a single figure becomes in fact a carrier of an entire world. The hair becomes the bearer of numerous stories. Oops, did I press something wrong? Would that, how do I, oh, sorry. So, and if the two heads come together, they form an horizon line of a narrative that might literally infiltrate each other and become one cohesive story. And this kind of ran through a certain moment in the paintings that I made. And I thought I might be sharing fragments of my work, and hopefully they might cohere in some ways along the way. Also, images like this, where the image of a collision then begins through the act of painting to appear like the body, to appear like a Rorschach ink blot, or large paintings like these, which this was called Allegory of the Endless Morning. This was about 35 feet long, and so the painting itself becomes like a long sentence that remains with you like an unspoken or unfinished line for the whole year. So it took me about 8 or 9 months to complete the piece, and I would return to it in the process of making other things. And so it just goes on. It deviates from where one set out to take it, and begins to sort of breathe and generate other images that were again unforeseen, like any two bodies that come into contact becomes an occasion for a possible sunrise. So there are like 6 sunrises that occur within the painting itself, or a body that becomes a plant or a tree, bifurcating between our own extended lungs in the plant world, and all kinds of thoughts that also appear in other pieces. For instance, there are certain works where the molecular form of hemoglobin and chlorophyll begin to sort of merge, and they have the same structure. The painting sits on a sculpture. In the previous instance, you may have seen that the painting is actually clasped by a sculpture. It's almost as the sculpture in the previous instance was uttering the painting. In this instance, the painting sits on it. And this sculptural form itself is a coming together of images that form the porch of a central railway station in Mumbai. And this is a place where 2 million people enter and exit every day. So it's possibly one of the most populated few square meters of land anywhere on the planet. And hence, in that moment of intense traffic, almost becomes like this playing field of almost all human emotions, or the desire to reach somewhere. And as a student, I've ran through that door too. But as an artist, you kind of stand in that door and you look up, and what you see is something you don't see when you're a student trying to catch a train, is there are these images of these animals that are mostly caught in acts of either making love or consuming food, or consuming each other because one construes another as food, and hence becomes this kind of sort of perpetuation of life and death that becomes this image that circles this railway station, which became like an alphabet for me. It appeared in few works that I've done. It kind of recurred through many things. So this was 2009, so a couple of years before I made the very first piece that I shared, Epilogue. And it's a video. I'm unfortunately not sharing the video because the enormity of the file didn't want to jam the system. But I would have loved to share it. It's a large projection that appears like a journey through a kind of cosmic field. And it's called Forensic Trail of the Grand Banquet. And the piece really, until either one finds the word banquet in the title or locates something that might appear as food, appears like a journey of stellar forms, of astral bodies, celestial bodies. This one happens to, of course, look like a donut once you know it, but it's also an Indian snack called the vada. And these were actually made in a doctor's laboratory. So it's a doctor's radiology lab, where briefly the studio drifted for a few weeks when I would, in their off time, land up with different food types. And many medical DICOM files of food then became the kind of starting point to begin kind of fashioning a universe. And this is actually an image of the food at that very point before it could possibly become body. If consumed and not scanned, and if returned as an ailing body, it would be an organ. And if trailed back, it could be traced back to the very stars and skies from where photosynthesized food becomes our body and energy and structure. So it kind of, in that moment where it could return forensically to where it came from, but also point to its possible future as body or organ. And yet it's a kind of silent video and kind of loops and runs through this immersive planetarium-like environment in a kind of museum or gallery space. That's a tomato. It's a piece of corn. But but Forensic Trail again finds a kind of recent incarnation, a very recent body of work, which I'll come to later. So 3 or 4 years later, after I made Forensic Trail, I made this photo piece called Preamble. And Preamble was a kind of large image of a roti. It's a bread. And it's a photo piece. But what happens if you move ever so little in the presence of the photo piece is it begins to kind of unveil its own negative, its own inverted image. And in this kind of unveiling, it seems to unveil a distant galactic kind of glimpse, but also begins to kind of appear a bit like one is looking at an asteroid or a reflected light on the surface of a planet. And in a way, I think of these as really reincarnations of forensic through kind of through the minimal gesture in a way, to do as little. I mean, Forensic Trail was a lot of gestures. I mean, there was scanning and it went on and on for several months, whereas this becomes really a twitch of the eye, and it's something to see if that can unfold as an experience, as a question. In the middle of all this, so there's this continuous shift in my work that happens between pointers to the sky and the distant domains of our own existence, but also returning continuously to the street. So this is in the middle of all of these narratives, sometime in 2005, a work that for which I kind of momentarily set up myself at a phone booth, which now doesn't exist anymore, used to be called the PCO, Public Call Office. It's called Artist Making Local Call. And the photo piece is actually quite large. It's 34 feet long, so it's really room scale, and the scale of the artist figure is the scale of the viewer in a way. So you feel in the middle of the street when you see the photo piece. So it's me making a phone call while the camera begins to take a picture, panoramic picture of the street. And this was done pre-iPhone and all of that, when you actually shot many, many pictures to make a single panorama. And as a result, in the panorama, what looks like a still photograph, which is in a way a moment, is a duration of time. So time is kind of held captive in what looks like a static image, because the camera is shooting several pictures and takes a while, almost the duration of a phone call, to complete its own cycle. Oh my God, this is it's like the blink of the eye. So in this instance, a rickshaw and a taxi happen to form a virtual collision that never occurred. But the collision occurs because the camera registers two pictures, one after the other. And in the time gone by, the two people on the either side of the collision have moved on from one end to the other. And they're also at the end of the frame. You find the same person there again here. And this kind of Muybridge-like urban march begins. Oh my God, sorry, I should look when I'm... or in this instance, a shadow is cast of a body that's not visible, because the body is actually on the side of that distortion you see there, is in the next frame. So in fact, it begins to open up ideas of death, mortality, time, but time also registered as this great inconsistency, because it's shot at a point where the morning and evening light seem to appear on both sides of the frame. It's simply because the sun is coming from the back, and gives this illusion of AM and PM at the same time. That's Barry Keldulis in the picture. who's in the house. So this was a piece called 365 Lives. It's exhibited at the ZCAM, and was made around the time that I made Artist Making Local Call. And while Artist Making Local Call was one kind of a panning view of the street, 365 Lives was an action of actually getting very close to a frame, an image, which is actually a dented car. So 365 Lives was actually a record of numerous cars, of almost like a collision scape of a city, where the act of collision of cars is more common than the act of not colliding, simply because of the numbers of cars. And there's a kind of registration of that collision, almost like it's left a dent of its own history, like a seismograph of a city that continues like this. But yet, if you see so many of them together, they begin to kind of invoke this idea of a bodily wound, which to me is something quite interesting, when a projection of our own extension of our bodies as an object then reflects back to us what our bodies might tell us. So in fact, these inanimate objects can tell us stories about ourselves. And about 4 years after I made 365 Lives was a piece called The Cry of the Gland. And The Cry of the Gland, again, was an act of occasionally stepping out of the studio. So some of these works were made over, say, 5 or 6 months by a gesture of returning to one thing repeatedly. So in this instance, it would be like requesting somebody passing by my studio if I could shoot their pocket. And because in India we don't wear jackets because of the weather, our pockets are often quite full of things. And the pocket, in a way, becomes this carrier of a narrative. It, depending on whether there's medicine in it, or a measuring tape, or a pen, or a taxi driver's tag, it begins to it becomes a portrait without looking at the face, or without, and begins to speak about time in that day, and it becomes a form of storytelling, I guess. But equally, this kind of appendage, this kind of tumor that protrudes from the body as a tumor of necessities, in a way, that you kind of append to your body. So this was a piece kind of going back to where the sculptures that held the paintings, or the paintings that sat on the sculptures, it's the same image that recurred through a few works, as I said. And one of the works in which it kind of came together fully was a work called Annexation. And Annexation is really an oversized primus stove. It's, because of its scale as big as a human body, it doesn't appear like a stove, like a cooking device. And yet, at some angles, one may recognize certain elements of that cooking device. But in a way, becomes this almost like a cycle of life, in sort of forming the outer crust of something that you would cook with. Its surface is the surface of black lead, which is carbon, which is essentially what gathers on a cooking device in its earlier iterations. And I remember, like my aunt kind of, in that same railway station I was speaking about, she would stay in a very distant suburb, and many other ladies like her would actually buy vegetables before they would board the train, and actually chop vegetables when they boarded the train to actually use the time. So the kitchen would actually extend all the way to the railway station. And these kind of thoughts kind of remain at the back of one's mind. To kind of, in a way, all of these images began to come together and crystallize as this form of the primus stove. These are a suite of sculptures. There are 4 of them, and this one's called Autosaurus tripos. The genesis of Autosaurus tripos could actually go back to something 4 or 5 years before this, which could also be the genesis of a piece such as Covering Letter, which we have here. And in a way, how Autosaurus tripos seemed to come about was really through this through a moment in the early 2000s in India, when there was a riot in a state of Gujarat, where the after effect of the riot, as any form of urban upheaval is the media image that follows. And the one media image that followed was the continuous burning down of vehicles as a kind of projection of human anger. But to me, this became like a projection of human folly. I mean, why do you burn a car when it's kind of unrelated? But you see this as a global phenomenon. I started making these drawings of completely burned down buses that look like fossils. But these drawings themselves, made in 2002, didn't go anywhere for me, and I'd almost forgotten about them. So almost 5 years later, that suddenly looking back at a completely discarded set of drawings, they became sculptures. And in the process of making the sculpture, of course, the work had moved and deviated away from what I was thinking of when I made the drawings, and became kind of objects unto themselves. For instance, Aquasaurus, which was exhibited in Sydney in 2009 at SCAF, Sherman Contemporary Art Foundation, is the scale of an actual water tanker. And yet it becomes like this image of death, a kind of coming together of the grotesque, but also the playful, the burlesque, the arabesque. There is the form of the tire here, for instance, which is made of life-affirming forms like flowers or petals. And so there's all kinds of contradictory sculptural images that actually form one unified sculpture. And yet, seen in parts, they begin to point to other ways of looking at the same image. But in 2002, while I actually made those drawings, following the image of the continuously burning vehicle, was the time I made this piece called Public Notice, 2002-2003. And this was exhibited here at the APT in Brisbane in 2006. So in Public Notice essentially was, I felt drawn to basically thinking about where were these gaps in society emerging from? Where was this kind of factional, sectarian impulse emerging from? And one of the thoughts that I had was maybe going back to words uttered when India actually found its independence, or founding words that were uttered when the nation was formed might be a place to look. And one of the things I started doing was kind of clerically kind of recounting or writing these words. So this is the speech delivered by India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, at the midnight of Indian independence. And the words appear completely charred, and the closer one gets to the surface of the mirror, the more the self is distorted around every alphabet, the closer one goes. The way of actually clerically writing it was actually by setting aflame each letter. I would kind of inscribe a letter with an inflammable fluid, and I would set it aflame, as if there was this repeat cremation of the words that would then register the letter permanently on the surface, and in its registration would warp the mirror, that would in turn continue to distort and make the self and the present kind of a reflective space in a way thereon. This was Public Notice 2, so it's almost now, when I look back, became like a trilogy. It wasn't meant to be one, so Public Notice, the first, wasn't called Public Notice 1. But 4 years later, I made a piece which is currently now being exhibited at the Art Gallery of Western Australia in Perth, so if any of you do go by to the West Coast. It's a speech, and a speech that was actually in my mind at the time I made the first Public Notice, but hadn't found a form. It's a speech delivered by India's sort of one of the greatest proponents of peace, Mahatma Gandhi, when he set out to break the brutal Salt Act, which denied every Indian the right to make salt. And having forewarned the British that he would break the act, he assumes he may be arrested or assassinated. And if that happened, he knew this would be an outbreak of violence. So he delivers the speech almost as a kind of manifesto of self-restraint, calling for complete civil disobedience, but with complete restraint, a total non-cooperation with total non-violence. And I think becomes in some ways a reflective space for any of us, not just within a broader political domain, but a text we can just return to at any point. And the speech, when you see it from a distance, appears like a chalk drawing on a wall because of its scale. It obliterates detail. The closer one gets, you realize that sitting on every shelf are these 4,600 sculptural forms, each one shaped like an alphabet, but taking the form of a fossil, a bone. And each of these public notice pieces essentially have the image within the word. And it is the reading of the letter as image alongside the word that actually I think creates probably a dimension of meaning or experience. This is a piece called Public Notice 3 and was a work from 2010. Once again, there were 3 previous iterations to the same speech that then culminated almost at the end of the decade to become Public Notice 3 at the Art Institute of Chicago in 2010. It opened on 9/11/2010 and closed on 9/11/2011. And this was a speech that actually was delivered on 9/11 but 1893, which happened to be the first Parliament of Religions. And at the inaugural address of the first Parliament was the Indian sort of religious leader called Swami Vivekananda delivering a speech calling for death of fanaticism, fundamentalism, bigotry, intolerance, all the words that kind of populated our imagination post 9/11/2001, but were actually the exact words spoken on 9/11, 108 years before the attacks in that same country. Also at a moment that seemed to be a projection of some kind of premonition, because this was prior to the world wars, before nations went to battle. This imagination that the future of conflict may be in religion and ideology seemed to be a thought into the future. And so the work is in the risers, in the sort of interstitial risers between steps. And 70,000 light bulbs form the speech, each word in a different color, each of the 5 colors that the US Homeland Security post 9/11/2001 had marked as a threat code in the Bush administration. In the course of the running of the exhibition, the Obama administration repealed it by complete chance, but it felt well timed. They repealed the 10-year coding system. This was actually the auditorium where Vivekananda spoke. The auditorium is now the staircase, which is actually the very site where the words were spoken, is essentially the very site where the speech was read in 2010. And being an encyclopedic museum, the work, in fact, gains from all the sight lines, because it's the corridors of Indian history and or Japanese, Tibetan, European modernism, and you'll read the text at the center of the museum through all of these sight lines, and you navigate it to get to any point in the museum in a way. So this is the piece we now have at the MCA called Covering Letter. And many of you may have seen it before now. It's a speech, as you know, which when you come into the room, of course, all you see is a cascade of words flowing towards you in inverse, and it gains some legibility at the bottom of the film of mist. And as it rises, it becomes more and more clear. As it gains complete legibility, it leaves. So there's this complete run of words rising and the mist descending. Essentially a speech delivered, a letter undelivered, but penned and authored with an intent to speak to Hitler 5 weeks before the outbreak of the Second World War. And to me, the first instance that I set my eyes on the letter, it appeared like this was possibly written to Hitler, addressed to him, but equally could have been intended to travel well beyond its delivery date and intended recipient, and speaks in first person to the reader as dear friend. Friends have been urging me to write to you for the sake of humanity, asking the reader to rethink what one can do with one's own life and world. And the letter leaves with the words, your sincere friend, M.K. Gandhi, and that's when you realize the author and recipient. And to me, this absent figures of the author and recipient become, I think, in some ways, a metonym for the human possibility itself of where we might bifurcate in which direction and how we might occupy that space in between these two figures, one possibly the greatest proponent of peace, writing to possibly the most brutal perpetrator of violence to have inhabited the planet at that point in time. This is a video, but I'll skip it since we've seen the work. It's a kind of fuzzy video. This brings me to a last few works, which is essentially the body of work that I've been working with in the last few months. These are drawings called Wind Study, the hour of the day, of the month, of the season. And they're possibly like the size of what the image is, just roughly about that size. They're drawings, sort of larger format drawings, and begin with a pencil drawing that I make within the studio. And I sort of step outdoors outside my studio and lay each of the lines, one line at a time, with an inflammable fluid and set it aflame. And as each line burns down, of course, the movement of the wind would direct the fire. And to me, in a way, the drawing becomes a space where I can actually realize how little I know of the environment I exist in. Because nothing in my body tells me the wind has moved from north to east to south to west. But the flame tells me exactly where it's moved. And in some ways, each line, each surrendering of each line to the wind, in some ways become some kind of a reminder of our own perceptual limits, but equally my own limits as an artist. In fact, this work really is a space where there's so little I do. It's almost, I feel like an eavesdropper in this conversation between wind and fire, and the drawing becomes some kind of a transcript of that conversation. So the wind studies, the sightings, and the third sculpture, which I'll share, were part of two exhibitions, one in Paris and one in Bombay, a few months apart. And they kind of carried themselves like interrelated bodies of work. So this is a work called Sightings D9M4Y2015, and appears like these distant intergalactic images. They're photo works. And the coding system seems like a notation in an astrophysicist's notepad of a distant sighting. But D9M4 is the date 9th month of April 2015, the day of the month of the year, when I went to a market very close to my studio and bought these 7 fruits. So that's an apple, an orange, papaya, pear, blueberry, plum, and fig. And they're mostly shot at plain sight. So they're actually, if you held an apple this close, that's the scale. They're not magnified. But what happens in the pictures is they're lenticular prints, and as you move in front of them, they invert and unveil their own negatives. And in fact, in that inversion, there's an orange, for instance, seem to once again point to what Forensic Trail, I think, set out several years ago, into this space between its own distant intergalactic past or its intercellular future, if the fruit consumed would transition from one to the other. And there have been a few sightings with variations between them, and I may not speak at length about them because of time. And seen alongside the wind study, the sightings were a new sculpture called the Infinite Episode. The Infinite Episode is almost like a sculpture where species are asleep. It's like a cosmic dormitory. The only thing that happens in the state of sleep is the animals get equalized in scale. So a sleeping lion and a sleeping mouse begin to share the same scale of body in that moment of sleep. And it's like a perennial thought I've had, that where were all of us last night, and where are we returning tonight, and do we surrender and gain something at that moment of sleep, and what do we surrender or gain? What's the scale of our bodies when we do surrender? Would a sleeping lion and a mouse actually have the same scale of body if they slept next to each other? Of course, if one awakes, the other would be in trouble. But it's really in that sort of space of speculation that this work came out of. And they are actually dental plaster, so they appear kind of fragile, but they are quite sturdy. This is a very recent video, and I think kind of draws together a lot of things that I've been thinking of for a while. It's a work called The Eternal Gradient, and it's a video ideally seen at a very large scale projection. It was projected quite large in its last iteration. This is a still, of course, but this is really how the video appears if you walk in at any point. It's just that in the actual video, they are ever so slowly transforming. it takes about 3 minutes for a complete new moon to become a new moon again, slowly moving from wheat dust to crescent moon to full moon to going through. And this is actually a lunar year. It's 365 moons of any year. And every year looks the same because there are that many full moons and new moons in any year. And this is how I'm kind of jumping through the video. If one actually jumps, this is how the gradient continues to move. And you only recognize after a few minutes that it's actually moved. So there's this transition of time that happens across this parentheses of time that we call a year. And yet it seems to be this infinite flow. But to me, what was central to the work as I was kind of making it, so I began with this infinite flow of time through a parenthesis of a year. But in the video, if one walks in when the 1st of Jan is a crescent moon, then that moment in the video corresponds to all the 1st of Jans that ever was, and all the 1st of Jans that ever will be a crescent moon. And hence, there's an infinity of infinities that are intercepting through each moment in the video. And in some ways, it kind of points to this space where we forget our understanding of time, that that we leave the space of duration and periodicity, and then we can't grapple what is time. And I think I kind of seek that question all the time, and this video, I think, points me some ways in that direction. Like if you shut the door and shut the window, where would we look for time? And then you could look at breath or heartbeat, but where do you stop? And how do you kind of fathom time? So this is the last work that I'll share, and it's a recent permanent sculpture which was unveiled in Lower Austria, and it's a piece called Here After Here After Here. I was invited by these 10 townships called 10 vor Wien that collectively are on the edge of Vienna, and I was pointed to a roundabout that I could, a few roundabouts that I could pick from in which I could conceive a sculpture, which kind of put me into a silent mode. I couldn't get past the idea of a roundabout. I struggled a lot with the whole idea of how do you actually parachute an idea into a place that you do not know, and all of that almost shut me down to a point where all the images I made on the site were not working for me. And there were lots of drawings in my book, and this is really the point of install. So it's about 60 feet wide and 22 feet high, so it's almost architectural in scale. And there was a moment at which I began looking at Google Earth as a kind of solution, because pictures taken on the ground wasn't working. And this is the roundabout on the top. There was a moment I would zoom in and out, and Google Earth allows you to hop from your studio to any point on the planet. And there was a moment when I completely exited the planet that the roundabout seemed to fit, the spheroid fit the circle. And in some ways, it kind of bound together all the drawings, all the disparate drawings, all the pictures, the figure of the snake, the Ouroboros, Celtic knots, all kinds of drawings, pictures taken on the ground around the roundabout, these signages which are omnipresent on any highway, all sort of coalesce to become this loop. And the loop essentially is a direction and destination tape which connects to any point on the planet. So it's actually Stockerau to Melbourne, 16,000 kilometers, or Stockerau to Boston, 8,900 kilometers, is the actual distance from that point on the planet to places all over the planet, but also the exact exits you might take from that point on the highway. So E52 would take you to Kabul, for instance. But you also will encounter then your gas stations and your amenities along the way. So it's actually a real document of a journey you might not take, in a space that also is actually a non-place, because unlike all places, roundabout is actually not a place at all, right? It's just a thing you circle around to get to a place. So it's almost like bringing together all these places in a place which is a non-place. It's possibly the only non-place in the world, no? I mean, the roundabout is just... That's Istanbul and Taipei. Thank you.
Okay, what a fantastic talk. We could be here all day. But I know that you all have other things on and you want to go back and I hope look at the exhibition and Jitish's work with fresh eyes now. We're almost out of time, so I'm just going to ask one or two very short questions, and then if people have questions for Jitish, we'll move straight on. But Jitish, I guess one of the first things I wanted to talk about was your material approach, because you work with objects, sculpture, installation, environments. You work with photography, you work with painting. I've seen some fabulous drawings, works on paper of yours as well. So you really work across the full spectrum of artistic production, but also your choice of materials is quite unusual. I mean, you work with everything from fog or mist through to dental plaster, wind and fire, roti, corn and tomatoes. Wow. Can you talk a little bit about this material approach? Because clearly it's really central to your practice. You've thought very carefully. These are not random choices. So can you just talk about the materiality of your practice?
Thanks, Richard. I occasionally deviating the studio to a doctor's lab. Yeah, but I think what happens to me is the material is possibly something that comes very late in the life of the work, and in a way, what comes to me, and I'm sure to a lot of artist colleagues too, is this peculiar sensorial, vague, misty, nebulous set of thoughts and ideas that, if they do survive a duration of gestation, begin to find their form. And so there are many that never completely, even form themselves. But once they begin to form, then some ways within the idea is its kind of birthing process. I try to remain as much out of the way as possible till that occurs. Once that happens and then there's a form, then of course some of these works can have a long period of actually trying to realize it and trying to work with the material in a way that if you actually have a 60 feet endless loop, could it feel like a sitting piece of paper loop in the landscape, or can the mist have other dimensions of meaning and experience depending on the way it's calibrated in relationship to the body? Those questions do come a little later, but generally between a certain idea or a certain inquiry to its form, in the best instances, I try to be out of the picture. Whenever I get in the way, I kind of don't get it right.
Okay. Look, another thing I wanted to talk to you about, which comes through subtly, and it's not something I've heard you address directly, but there's a very clear intersection of the personal and the political within your practice, because on one hand you're dealing with this incredibly important history of India post-partition. You're dealing with speeches, political acts and gestures, questions around violence, non-violence, and you yourself touched on this theme of war, politics and ideology. But then on the other hand, we've got this incredibly intimate personal narratives, the lifespan of your father, what ordinary people in the street outside the studio carry in their breast pocket. Can you just talk about this intersection of the personal and political and where that takes place within your practice?
I mean, at the sort of risk of being misunderstood, I might say that almost everything one makes is autobiographical. Exactly. There's no escaping from the subject position of your own personal inquiry as the kind of pivot around which it might seem as distant from you as the world. So it could seem distant in time and place and space and context. And yet it has to actually only begin and end with you, is my feeling. Like any time, if I have to really go back to where the first public notice came from, it wasn't about trying to tell anyone else any story. It really came from really not understanding where we were headed in time and which is the space that I could look for an answer. And I said, if I can start looking at words uttered at a certain moment in time, I can maybe reincarnate them today for me and try and understand where I am now in the context of a family, city, nation, state, planet, universe.
Sounds like the Google map.
And in a way try to sort of localize oneself through these elements that could be anywhere in space and time to understand the present in a way.
Well, that really leads me to my final question. And in fact, you summed up that idea of inquiry in your practice quite nicely, because you described your practice as a space of speculation. But going back to the beginning of your talk, you talked about this sense of the relative, and you said that your practice was really about glimpsing infinite truth through the relative. And I think this play of micro and macro worlds, as well as cycles within your practice, is very interesting. Can you talk about that relationship between, the kind of tiny detail versus the kind of, cosmic, sometimes astrological or astronomical view that you give us in your work, and how they connect? And also this idea of cycles, because I keep seeing phases of the moon, I see references to the sun, I see astronomical or, physical data that recurs again and again in your practice.
Yeah, it's been a thought that every time one looks at anything, one is only looking at a fragment, And when one looks at it long enough, you realize that you're trying to get beyond the blurry edges of your own vision, trying to see a little more than you can see, just in plain sight, every day, every moment. So which means we're actually making a relative choice in every glimpse of our life. And the artistic process is quite similar. Because there's no one way to fathom all of reality, one begins to fathom fragments of reality, which actually then transports you in the space of the relative. Because the moment you look at a part, the part is a relationship to what is the perceived whole, and hence, for me, it's really about what one might look at and for how long. Because the moment you look at something for longer, it begins to transfer meaning just through your own gaze. And so in certain instances, say for instance, when it's about going close to a pocket, it's about creating both proximity and duration of seeing something still for a longer duration, which is something quite far away. But if you draw close, it begins to, and that could also then lead to being the surface of a fruit, really close, and maybe seen at a point where also maybe just this thought that we all know that I'm seeing orange seeds, but they are not saffron or orange, but it's just that the lights delivered to my eyes is eliminating every other color from the spectrum. And by that sheer deduction, I could then recede back and try and erase this hallucination of my lived reality and see it in the very inverse. And in its inverse, it might say another truth. So if I kind of try and look at the roti again, by eliminating the hallucination of the colors that I perceive an apple to be red, maybe in its inverse, it begins to point into another point in space and time. And just that kind of question of, in the experience of this shift in glimpse, perhaps there's a shift in meaning.
Okay, well, I think space of speculation is a very nice summation of these huge questions within the practice. But in the last couple of minutes, I wanted to open up to you, because I can see hands already, because I know that there are questions that you're dying to ask Jitish. So please, Barry, I can see you've grabbed that microphone. Go for it.
Jitish, I've always sort of, contemporary art as a marriage of ideas and aesthetics, and obviously, we could talk for hours about the ideas behind almost any one of your works. And I'm just wondering if, but also for me, most of your works, almost without exception, are incredibly beautiful as well. And I'm just wondering, as somebody who has made a flower out of road signs, whether you actually strive for beauty at some point in the process, or whether it seems to come naturally.
I think we're all kind of drawn to what we think of as beautiful things. But I'm not a seeker of beauty, I think the beauty is perhaps best experienced as an afterimage. You might have a conversation, and the recollection of that conversation can be extremely beautiful. And I think that is that space in which I would like, experiences to remain, that beauty, of course, is a very complex term, because that's it's a quality that can be perceived. Each one's beauty is a different form of beauty. So it's not just the aesthetic beauty for aesthetic purposes. So it's not a result that would result in beauty, or a journey that would result in beauty, but beauty as a kind of carrier. And I'm drawn to think of many beauty versions that come to my mind even when I use the word. So I don't know whether we are perceiving beauty as the same word, but to sort of to open up in ourselves a small window would mean that we have a shared affinity of an experience that we both want to engage with. That is the space of the beautiful. That is also the space of beautiful in a conversation, because that's that window. And I think if an artwork has that space, and it needn't be beautiful in the conventional aesthetic sense, but the moment that perforation opens between a viewer and the experience, that is the space of beauty in which a transmission can occur. It's just that the wavelength then align in a way.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. I see a hand right over here.
I just wanted to ask how you thought about the viewer's experience in terms of your incredible reverence for duration. Because I was, for some strange reason, when I looked at your public notice number 2 when it was at the art gallery, I actually timed how long it took me to read it, and it was 22 minutes. And so I think I did that out of reverence to how intricate the making of the work was, and I wanted to kind of put it into I wanted to draw some sort of parallels between how long someone needed to spend time because of the work, because of the history of the speech. All of those lines, I wanted to know what thought you gave to the viewer's experience.
Thank you. Let's say in Public Notice 3, since you've seen Public Notice 2, I'll probably talk about Public Notice 3, which is the one that followed at the Art Institute of Chicago. Once again, there is, say, a durational aspect to the experience of actually reading. You come from the two sides of the grand staircase, and you can only come from one side. So there is the other side that you haven't come in from. Then it bifurcates, and you can only go from one of those sides. And there are 4 extensions that lead you to 4 other sides in the museum. You can only take one of them. And so you start reading on your way up, 118 steps. And there is duration, and there's word, and there's light, and there's color, there's the retention, the inversion of light as colors overlap. But to me, in an experience like, say, Public Notice 2, unlike the linear form of Public Notice, in Public Notice 3 as opposed to the linear form of Public Notice 3 where you circle in the space, here you might go right to the top and feel you haven't read from below, and if you come down, you create an echo of the same words because they are doubled on each side and quadrupled on their way up. And to me, that was again a kind of way of returning the echo of the word spoken in its now clerical rendition as word in that same site, to return the echo into the architecture by this doubling and quadrupling in a way that the viewer can actually give voice to the word once again, and if read twice, give double voice and echo. So in each artwork, there's a different way in which time and duration might play, or the eternal gradient, in the fact that it almost never looks like it's moving, is quite central to the fact that it's moving. That we can all commit to trying to attend to the movement of time here, and depending on how we commit ourselves, we can experience time very, very differently now. And the video tries to work with the viewer and with me when I'm making it or thinking about it in that sense.
Okay, well, I'm afraid time has triumphed this time at this point. I will just point out before we finish, there are some other wonderful programs coming up as part of Telling Tales. I'm doing a curatorial tour tomorrow at 1. We have wonderful live shadow puppet performances by the Indonesian artist Jumadi that are running right through June and July. You can hop onto the MCA website to get dates and times and booking process. And I also just want to take this opportunity to recommend to you in July, the second weekend of July during NAIDOC week, we have 3 wonderful senior women artists coming from Warman in the East Kimberley as part of the exhibition to make some programs. I also recommend this beautiful catalogue, which has essays on everybody's work, including yours, Jitish. But in closing, I'd just like to thank you for such thoughtful, engaging, kind of endlessly interesting presentation. I'm going to be ruminating, I know, for days about this. But thank you for sharing your work with us, for expanding it beyond what you see here today at the MCA. And I hope that you've all enjoyed this. Do go back, and I hope you see the work with new eyes. Thank you, Jitish.
Thank you. Thank you.